Hello. It's exciting to see so many of you here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Jo Stoffelbach-Hines. Welcome to this evening's Dallas Architecture Forum lecture with award-winning and highly esteemed architect Billie Tsien of Todd Williams Billie Tsien Architects. We're honored that you've joined us. The forum is grateful to our seasoned benefactors, Briggs Freeman Sotheby's International Realty and Reggie Graham Maharger Development, for their leadership and their support. We're also thankful for our fall series benefactors, Architectural Lighting Alliance, Corrigan Associates, MAP Construction, and Mod Media ModernDallas.net. We also appreciate our reception underwriter for this evening, HDR Architecture. Please join me in thanking all of those who made this special evening possible.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is make this thing go lower. How low do you think it could go? That's it. All right. I called this lecture a deliberate practice, and one of the things I think that as Todd and I go along in the practice and the career, we've been starting to think about what are the values that drive the work. And we'd like to imagine that our work changes, and I think it actually does change from place to place, from project to project, but what stays the same is a set of beliefs. The first one is that we want to be of use. I remember when I was in architecture school, and I think it was very late at night, and one of the teachers came in, and I think he had had a lot to drink, and I think he must have had a really bad meeting, because he sort of stood in front of everybody who's bent over their desks and kind of yelled, "Architecture is just a service industry," and then he stormed out. And we didn't know what that meant. But actually, to be of service is a wonderful thing. And sometimes when you do it well, it's actually a very noble thing. So we'd like to be of use, and we'd like to serve. We'd like to move slowly. As the world moves ever faster, I suppose we also move somewhat faster too. But we have a tendency to want to dig in our heels and to take more time, which is why it's important to say no. I think that often when you're young, it's hard to say what you want. And sometimes it's easier to say what you don't want. And Todd says by saying what you don't want, you start to define yourself. And I think we've said no to work that needs to move faster than we think is right, and no to work where we feel we don't have a connection to the aspiration. The next one is to relate. And we want always our work to have a very strong connection to the place where it's made. Todd and I have a sort of discussion, so he wants to use the word belong. Maybe because my parents were immigrants and I don't ever feel like I really belong, but I feel like I relate. I'm much more interested in the word relate, so that we want our work to feel connected, but also slightly separate, but always related. And finally, we would like to make work that is built in a way so that it lasts, because we believe that we're making marks on the earth. We're all architects making marks on the earth, and we want them to have meaning and to last. This is a slightly strange picture of our office because it's missing the building on the other side of it, but now there's a very big high-rise going up next door, so we're in the building. This building was built about 125 years ago, when Central Park was a very unfinished, sort of rough place, and was actually a series of artist studios. So we're on the bottom floor So the 2 windows that you see on the ground floor are our studios, and people often walk past and they kind of wave. So we've seen students and clients and just people who can't figure out what we're doing standing outside our windows and staring in. But we believe that we are a family. And when Todd and I started out, the people in our family were more like our brothers and sisters, and now they're more like our children. But people have a tendency to stay quite a long time in our office. We try to keep as flat a hierarchy as possible. So Todd and I sit with everybody else, and although we don't participate in chore day, we do things like, clean out the kitchen from time to time, and we dump the garbage. So it is a studio, it is a family. Everybody is responsible for everything. So tonight I wanted to show 4 projects and then some boxes. And it's interesting Todd and I lecture together, and we also lecture apart. So whenever we lecture together, he's always telling me to back up because he has a sense of sort of wanting to go more slowly. And I should be wanting to go more slowly since that's what I just said in the earlier slide about beliefs. But I become very sort of compelled, worried about time. So that sort of says who we are as people. We are trying to make it to the same final point, so which is the end of this lecture, I suppose. But we have different ways of going about it. We're very, very different. He's very tall. I'm relatively short. And I would say he is a person who is always thinking about movement. And he sees the world as a 3-dimensional place. And I think I'm always looking for a place to stop. And I see the world really as a series of almost paintings. My earlier training was in fine arts, and so I see things sequentially. So that allows us to work together without having too many really big fights, but there are interesting discussions. So the first project I'm going to talk about is the Folk Art Museum. And you may know that it doesn't exist anymore, but it is still very crucial to our body of work and the way we think about other buildings and other museums. We like to make buildings that feel heavy. I was, of course, at the Kimball today, and that building feels obstinate and heavy. I'm talking about the original Kimball. And I was saying, it's interesting to see an amazing building at different times in your life because you appreciate different things about the building at different points in your life. It's like reading a novel that you loved when you're 20, and then it completely changes when you're 40, and it changes again when you're 60. So I appreciate what Kahn did more and more because of the power it takes to sort of withhold. And I think one of the things that we were looking at when we thought about the Folk Art Museum was, how do you make a building that is a kind of obstinate building and that sort of is not, that is a slow discovery, that withholds. So this is the site. It was a tiny site, 40 feet wide, and eventually was right next to the Taniguchi addition to the Museum of Modern Art, which had really sort of showed 2 faces of New York, one very, very smooth, and the other one we wanted to make for the Folk Art Museum much more textural and feel slightly more gritty and also more solid. So folk art, you probably know, is art that's been done by people who are not trained to be artists. So it can be an itinerant sort of portrait painter, M.I. Phillips. It can be this brown animal is by an ex-slave named Bill Traylor. The train drawing that you see is by an artist named Martin Ramirez, and then a kind of anonymous weather vane. And so all of these are pieces that are made by people who weren't necessarily trained to be artists. It's all fairly small in scale and also work that is very personal. So this idea of texture and something that made the building feel very personal was important to us. So of course we use the computer, but this was our first building where we were flipping over from hand drawing to computer. We still think a lot with our hands. And these two sketches were Todd's early ideas of trying to make a building where you would walk, because I said he was always interested in movement, where it was almost like a Guggenheim inside a shoebox, so where you would continuously walk and walk up and down these incline ramps. We have fairly big arguments about this because he loves this idea of the inclined walk, and I have, looking at the schedule, sort of a desire to have things happen a little bit more quickly, but we realized in the drawings that there was not enough space for this kind of circulation. So that sort of changed, but the idea of a central void that brought the light from the top down through the body of the building did remain. This is an early sketch that Todd did, which is looking at this idea of a sort of faceted, inward-turning building that didn't necessarily reveal itself, although when you were inside the building, you could see out through the slots, kind of cracks that happened between the panels. Then on the floor plans, you can see that the ground floor is largest because it goes all the way back, but each floor has a slightly different footprint. And what we tried to do was to make each floor feel different so that you would have a very rich experience as you walk through the building. So this was not a white box gallery space. It was a much more configured gallery space, and in a way, thinking about almost being like a house. So the section then shows the skylight, the light coming down from the top. Certainly today at the Kimball, the sense of light is so powerful, both in the piano edition and certainly in the Kahn edition. And that connection to natural light, I think, is the thing that enlivens us all. So although the slot became very small, the light does fall from top to bottom. The lobby was quite simple. We tried to make it from very common material. And so the stairway was clad in fiberglass, which I was reminded today comes from Garland, Texas, where we had it cast. And then the slot you can see running through a concrete stair, which is a cantilevered stair, and sort of ribbons back and forth. And then in the center there was a very large stair that was actually a kind of belly or basket that took the light and sort of held the light in the center. And Todd was thinking actually about the Laurentian Library stairs and the sort of scale of it being a kind of surprising thing. So this is a big stair in the middle of a small building. So we were trying to make many ways of moving through the building, and this is so much related to Todd. When we lived in an apartment in Carnegie Hall, he blew out one of the walls so that there was a bathroom in the center and you could basically walk all the way around. And it was because he felt like he never wanted to be trapped. And I think he also, that this happens, we have in so much of our work, we're thinking about how you move through and what you see when you look back. The development of the facade was a very important part of the project. And one of the things that people think we do is we do things with materials that are inventive. But actually, we aren't very inventive ourselves. What we do is we go to places where people make things, and we watch how they make them, and then we try to think of how we can use what they know to make things in maybe a slightly different way. So when we thought about casting the facade of the building, Todd immediately said he wanted to do a building where the facade was cast on 53rd Street and sort of pulled up. that wasn't a very practical idea. So instead we started to think about who could cast the facade. And we realized that the place that would be most amenable to casting a facade is an art foundry, because the amount of the facade was not really that big. It was about 3,500 square feet flat. And they're used to having all kinds of crazy demands. So we went to Talix, which is an art foundry in upstate New York. They cast Jeff Koons's work. And so they're used to working with quite difficult things. And so for them, to cast a flat panel was relatively easy. And so we went there, looked at how they cast things, and then looked at sand casting, which was a kind of very traditional technique of casting metal. And those are actually Todd's legs. He's lifting up the metal plate after it cooled, and we were sort of making marks in the sand to see what we could do with the material. In the end, we decided we weren't going to make marks in the sand, but we were going to let the sand simply be the casting material. But then each panel itself was different. So it bore the mark of how it was made. It bore the mark of the person who made it. And we felt that that was very connective to this idea of what folk art really was. So although it no longer exists, it still in our minds influences a lot of the work we do. And it's a representation, I think, of our beliefs. We made it to last, even though it did not last. So then the next project is the Barnes Foundation, and I'm going to go a little bit more deeply into that project. So Albert Barnes was a self-made, very wealthy man. And what he did was actually he bought the rights to this drug called Argerol, which is a sort of silver nitrate drug that is put into the eyes of babies to prevent infection when they're born. And so with all this money, he amassed a very interesting collection of art. And he was very good friends with John Dewey, and he believed that through art, everyone could have an education, and that you could start to see art whether or not you had had previous art training, you didn't have to know about art history. What he wanted people to do was think about art as line, color, and form. And so when you see the way he hung his gallery, you'll see that there was a very sort of pedantic idea of why he hung the things the way he hung them. So he had a house and a gallery designed for him in Marion, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. And it was originally an arboretum, so it had very beautiful gardens growing around it. He was quite a cantankerous person, so you probably aren't able to read the words, but he would write these very long letters, and here he's writing to Paul Cray. Paul Cray was the architect for the original Barnes Foundation. Paul Cray was the dean of the architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was actually a teacher of Lou Kahn, so he's Lou Kahn's master. And Lou Kahn worked for Paul Cray. I think Dr. Barnes was probably a really difficult client, but he's saying here that he didn't want to have his museum be for the elite or the cognoscenti. He calls people who know about art eunuchs, morons, boobs, and professional exploiters and general counterfeits. And he's asking Paul Cray for having a mitrailleuse, which is basically a machine gun, an electric chair, or a loose stone that would lead to an underground dungeon. And all of these things were supposed to be at the front door because when the people he didn't like would come in, he wanted to have the ability to sort of pull a switch and have them fall through the floor into some place where he wouldn't have to see them anymore. But that all goes back to this idea that he had, that he wanted to put together this collection not for the wealthy and not for the elite and not for people who knew about art, but for people who could learn about art. So this was the building that Paul Cray designed. It's a neoclassical building. it's quite handsome. It's stripped and sort of quite sober. When you're inside, this was the original Marian building. You can see that all the paintings are hung. Each wall is a kind of ensemble. So there's a bilateral symmetry. So there's a center line that runs through each ensemble. And then to either side, there are similar paintings. So if you have a Renoir nude on one side, you'll have a Renoir nude on the other side. And then in between, there's hardware. And the hardware often had shapes, sort of shapes like a body or a breast or legs. And what you were supposed to do is start to look between painting and painting and start to compare the shapes, compare the colors, and then also look from top to bottom and start to make relationships between the color blue on Cézanne's woman to the color blue on the sheets, to the sort of vertical position of this woman sitting there with Cézanne, to the women standing to either side. And it was supposed to lead you into looking at art without being afraid that you didn't know the facts. So the Franklin Parkway is the great civic thoroughfare of Philadelphia. And here you see it's in 1925. The Philadelphia Museum of Fine Arts is the building towards the foreground. And then the Franklin Parkway is this very broad street that runs down to City Hall. So City Hall is at one end, the tower at the other end is the Museum of Fine Arts. The Barnes Foundation decided that they needed to move their building for a number of reasons. Number one is that the mechanical systems were really putting the artwork in jeopardy. Number two was that the people who lived around this, the foundation really didn't want to have people visiting, so it was very, very hard to get in, and you had to make an appointment. And number three, they were going bankrupt because not enough people were visiting. And also, number four, it was not very true to the original desire of Albert Barnes, which was to be an educational foundation for the good of all. So in the past, and this is an early sketch, and when we went into the interview, they asked 6 or 7 different architects to just come in with ideas. And so, different architects, some people came in with a whole set of models and buildings that were finished. And we really came in with sketches and a very small model. And the sketch was, in the past, you were a gallery in the garden. When you moved to downtown Philadelphia, can you bring the garden into the gallery? Because when you looked at the paintings, it was so intense. It was like looking at a kind of crazy ping pong game, because you're going back and forth like this all the time, until by the time you finished the first floor, you were exhausted and you felt like you couldn't even take anymore. So we brought in this little wooden model, which was solid, which was the existing gallery as Cray had designed it, and started to pull it apart and drop in the gardens. And that was our idea for keeping the galleries intact, but dropping us in a sense of serenity and peace. In order to move the museum from Marion to downtown Philadelphia, the board had to go to the courts of Pennsylvania because they needed to really sort of break one of the desires in Barnes's will, which is that nothing be moved in the galleries. Everything had to stay the same. So the judge ruled that the gallery could move if the ensembles stayed the same and if the sequence of galleries stayed the same. So everyone who interviewed for that project had to sign an agreement which said, I will keep the ensembles the same, I will keep the sequence of the galleries the same. And we were given a site in downtown Philadelphia, which is on that Franklin Parkway. Here's the Museum of Fine Arts, and as I said, that's the main thoroughfare. There's the Rodin Museum, the Free Library, and the Franklin Institute, also located there. This is a drawing by Laurie Olin, who was our landscape architect. And We worked with him to keep the fabric of the Franklin Parkway, which is a series of 200-year-old sycamore trees that go up and down the parkway, and at the same time try to enhance the idea of a garden. So we could have had the front door be right on the Franklin Parkway, but we wanted you to enter a garden before you entered the museum itself. And so the whole entry sequence is very much about slowing things down and leaving behind the sense of the parkway and the busyness of Philadelphia. So you can see here in the foreground are the Franklin Institute, which is a kind of science institute, and the Free Library. Here's the Barnes Foundation. You can't see the Rodin Museum because it's behind trees, the Philadelphia Museum of Fine Arts. So you can see that we wanted the building to feel in some way related, but not necessarily actually of the fabric, but connected to the fabric. So we used limestone. We continue with Laurie, the sort of sycamores running up. Philadelphia is a city of big fountains, so we have a very long water table, which is a kind of public gesture to the Franklin Parkway. And what you see on the Franklin Parkway is really an interpretation of the original Cray facade, which is a kind of stripped, in this case, a very stripped sense of neoclassicism with the three bands. All of the windows had to stay in the same place because the gallery stayed in the same place. So essentially, the facade, with the exception of the two insertions, which are a study and an interior courtyard, is the same. So it's a slightly stretched building. In many ways, Todd's always said that's was a sort of gift to us because we were sort of overwhelmed with the project, very excited. But when we were given that set of parameters, it slightly releases you to think about the rest of the building and then come back. So this is an early image. Things are much more grown in, but here's the Franklin Parkway, this very long table of water, which is civic. And then you walk up this pathway and into a more contemplative garden and enter from this side. So the stone is from the Negev, and we looked at a number of different stones and chose this one because it was very warm. This is planted with these red maples, and then there's a pool of water that runs alongside the entrance. We looked at the collection, and one of the things that Barnes is noted for is that he had a very interesting collection of African art. And it wasn't African art as a kind of anthropological study. He really saw the beauty, and so it was really his African art is looking at African art and looking at at that time, his contemporary art, and seeing the relationship between the two. He also collected African fabrics, and so here, this is a kente cloth, which is a cloth that's woven in strips, and then the strips are sewn together. And so we started to think about, we have this gallery, and then we have another building, which is the support for the gallery. How do we make it both separate but united? And we started to think about cloth wrapping the gallery. And we started to look at the sort of irregular panels of the kente cloth, but how when they're sewn together, they start to hold things together. We looked at 4 different stones, 2 of them from Portugal, one of them American, the other one from Israel, and built full-scale mock-ups that were looking at both the details of how they get together, how they're put together, because they're mounted with a rain screen, a stainless steel rain screen behind, and eventually chose the Israeli stone. It's actually a Palestinian Israeli stone, and then went to the quarries there to choose the stone and to talk to the people who were working the stone. So once again, it's not something that we sort of imagined all by ourselves. We learned about the stone by going to the quarry, and we try to work with and try to do this as much as possible, to go to the places where the brick is made, where the stone is quarried, where the tiles are glazed, because we learn so much from these people because they actually have the knowledge in their heads and in their hands. And while we were there, we saw that there were people who were working the stone with a chisel. And we decided at first we were going to just use the sort of honed, low honed finish for the stone. And then we realized we could get a number of different finishes for the same stone. So we have a kind of stone, some of the stone is smooth and a low hone. Some of it is just chiseled in a very sort of random fashion. And then we saw that they were chiseling almost like in a sort of hieroglyphic way. And so we asked them to chisel some of the stone in these horizontal lines. So we're using the same material, but treating it in a different way, and treating it in a way that we learned about from being at the quarry. So this is this idea of leaving behind the city and then walking towards this sort of quiet garden. In the very back, you can see there's a wall. It's a floating wall, so there's a cut at the bottom of the wall so that the water goes through, and that also has to do with a sort of Chinese garden, which is that you have a sense of something that you imagine but you can't really see. And that goes back to the idea, again, that like the folk art museum, that you want to somehow withhold a little bit of what's going to happen so that everything isn't always visible, that you take the time to start to get to know what's inside. It's like getting to know what's inside a human being so that it's not so much, and as I become older, you realize it's not so much about what's here, it's sort of what's inside you. So this is the stone. We saved money on the stone by saying that we would completely accept all variation in the stone. So it makes for a richer texture, and it also allowed us to lower the cost because the range was so great. And we're very interested in a kind of imperfection. And that's not to say we love it when things go wrong on a project, but this idea of something where you have a sense of it being made by humans. That's very, very important to us. And of course, the stone is not made by humans, but that sense of the variation, so you don't feel as if it's simply manufactured, but it's something that comes from the ground. In the original Barnes building in Marion, there were various reliefs that were in the building, and so in a small way, we're trying to add these bars of stone that start to create a kind of relief. We had a sort of mantra that we kept on saying, which is simplify and intensify. So we had to work with the material that was originally part of the gallery space, but we tried to always think about simplifying it and intensifying it. So you see at the bottom of the screen is the bar building, and because it's a symmetrical plan, before the end of each gallery, we inserted the two spaces, which are this study and the garden. And then the L-shaped building is really support spaces. So this is a changing exhibits gallery. There's a cafe here. This is back of house. And here you come up the pathway, and then you've walked around, you enter, and then you come in to the lobby, and then you enter again from the side. So it's about a slow entry. Nothing is absolutely direct. Here's the lobby. There's stairs that go downstairs, and we used wooden stairs. Much as the piano uses wooden stairs, it's both easier on the feet, but also it's implying that there's some sense of a kind of residential scale. This is the restaurant, which is in the L-shaped building, and you can see out the window there's a quite wild garden, and the slot in the wall that allows you to sort of see back. You can follow the water back towards the entry. So here you can be in that lobby and look out to where you're coming from, but nothing is ever very direct. You're always sort of moving off course. And then this is a mosaic, which was based on an traditional African weaving texture called liar's cloth. And so it's once again a kind of homage to the African material that is part of the Barnes collection. We needed to make a place that felt serene. I said that the looking at the collection was so intense. A lot of people, when they went to the original Barnes, would only go to the ground floor, and they didn't even realize that there was a second floor. So what this does, this light court, is a place where you can go and not necessarily not be outside, but feel as if you're outside because you're underneath the shifting light. We pulled away the gallery building from the L-shaped building, and here you can see we also used felt that was made from silk and wool by a Dutch fabric artist named Claudia Jongstra. So there are many things that happen. This becomes their sort of social space where performances happen. And then outdoors, the light box also cantilevers over an outdoor space, which is also then a kind of social space. UT Arlington, I saw for Jason, he brought me a sectional model of the light box. But this is a drawing that we worked on with Paul Morantz, who's a lighting designer. And so what we wanted to do was bring the light in, but never have people be able to see the source of light. And of course, in the evening itself, it's lit up so that it becomes a kind of beacon for the building. This is the Changing Exhibits Gallery. And then this is the entry into the sort of the traditional gallery. And here, this is Todd's sketch using, once again, an African motif to make these big doors which close when the public space is open, but the gallery is closed. So this is the old gallery in Marion, and one of the reasons why we felt it would be, why the board felt it was important to move it to a place where there could be a more diverse audience than there used to be, because it was a difficult place to get to. And this is when we first toured the old Barnes with the director, and the lighting was terrible, the shades were always down, the windows were frosted, and you really felt as if everything was very, very dingy. And what he did was he pulled up the shades, and we looked at a Cézanne, and the colors just completely transformed themselves. So we worked very hard to bring natural light into the galleries. And what we were allowed to do was build off-site an actual gallery, and then work and try to figure out the details in that gallery. And then also bring in a skylight, which completely, once again, sort of shields the light so you don't see where the light is coming from, but delivers natural light to the gallery. And here you can see these are different. The yellower wall is the wall with the actual Cray design molding. And then the grayer wall is where we're looking at the Cray design molding and trying to figure out how to simplify it and intensify it. And people came and said, oh, we're so glad that you kept the galleries exactly the same. But if you look at this, the far side is the existing gallery, and then this is our version of the newer gallery. So windows, they said, oh, we're so glad that you kept the wooden windows. They were so important to the way the space felt. But they were always white metal windows, and they were always frosted. So in a way, it's creating a memory that never existed. But what we're trying to do is really try to understand what the character of the place was, so that we could be true to the character, even if we weren't reproducing exactly what was there. Once again, you see the sort of, on the far side, the shades were once again down. This is one of the rare times when they opened the windows, but you could never see out the windows except for that central portion because everything else was frosted. And here we simplified the relief at the top because we had to incorporate lighting, and the windows, because of a new glass technology, are allowed to then be most of the time open. So many of the people who've come to this gallery have said they thought that the paintings were all cleaned. So this is the new gallery, and none of the paintings have been cleaned, but the light is alive, and that really changes the way you see the art. So these are all the galleries as they've been reproduced. This is the study room, the stairs to the upper level, light coming in where it never came in at the upper level. And then this is really one of their most famous paintings, Joie de Vivre. And it was the one painting we were allowed to move because it was hung in a stairway. So we created a small gallery out of an office so you could actually go up and look at this painting. This is actually the gallery that I showed you where the director had pulled up the shades. And here now there's natural light and a connection to the outdoors. Some of the African material. This is the garden. And then stairs down to the lower level. And the lower level, this is the garden going, the courtyard going all the way through the building and down to this lowest level. And indeed, we, before we worked on this project, we brought the people from the Barnes board to the Kimball. And we went back into the office spaces, and we were looking at how beautiful the light is. It doesn't need to be totally open, but when you can bring light down in that way, it makes people feel as if they're connected to the outdoors. This is the library at that level, and this is that very deep courtyard. There's a conservation area on the top floor. It's the only one with a really big window. And here you can see it, and you can start to see the profile of this shape that brings in the light. The third project is the Asia Society. Hong Kong is a quite amazing city, and you can see in red here our site. And it's a vertical city, and our site was a British munitions barracks. And when it was built, the water was actually much, much closer. So all of this is landfill. This is what the site looked like when we first saw it, and it was abandoned and had at one time held black powder. And this is a sketch which shows how the site has developed. So it was at one time just very steeply sloped. The British made a little platform, and they would run the black powder on a cable lines down to the waiting ships. The buildings came in, tall buildings all around it, and then this is our building being a horizontal building in a vertical city. This was our model that we made for this competition. And it really is the restoration of the three buildings that you see here. And then there's a kind of deep chasm through which water runs, and this fourth building, which was built in the 40s. Our building is a kind of bridge building. It is a convention center for the Asia Society, and then there's a bridge that takes you across this chasm to the restored buildings, and then these two green forms are big berms, which were built so that if the powder exploded in one building, it wouldn't catch fire, catch the other building on fire. So the berms themselves are as much a part of the architecture as the buildings. Berms and buildings are sort of equivalent. And I think really with this project, we started to think about how buildings sit in the land and how earth can be as important as buildings. And we want our buildings to be in balance with the landscape. So I said that it's really a horizontal building. So this is the way most people see this building because it's surrounded by tall buildings. Here you can see the steeply sloping site, and this is at the bottom of the site. And this is a restoration of one of the earlier buildings that you see on this side, and then this new building that we designed with a garden in between. We looked in Asia for a stone from Asia. So this is a kind of almost deep forest green stone from Burma. And behind that wall, which is quite solid, is a garden. And that garden has water dropping from it. So I'm just going to go back for a second. This is going back again to the thought of the Barnes Foundation. This is once again a kind of opening through which you have a sense of the water dropping. And this is protecting you from immediately understanding that you're on the edge of really a kind of jungle. And then you pass through and the water drops down and you enter into that jungle. This is climbing up the stairs to the roof of the Asia Society. And then the roof is, as I said, the primary facade. And it's a sort of terrace, and it's also a bridge. And it's also a lower bridge, so it takes you from one side to the other. The lower bridge is there to protect you, to have a protected pathway, because there are terrifically heavy rains that happen. And it's also a way of bringing all of the utilities to the upper site, and so that they were invisible. Looking back to the new building, and then the upper site, we added an overhead canopy, which is thinking about in Chinese gardens, there are overhead canopies. And you can see on the ground, there are the tracks where the little small trolley cars used to trundle by carrying their loads of explosive powder. So these spaces were restored. And actually, a huge part of the restoration is what you don't see. So all of the mechanical systems are put in a very big vault, which is over here. This is a building that we turned into a gallery space, and adjacent to it is one of these huge berms, the great presence of these sort of military berms. 8-foot thick walls in this building, so we simply cut through the walls, and the walls are so thick that they keep the temperature and humidity really quite level. This is an art gallery. And then we cut through the berm, and then that takes you to a small performance space. Finally, I just wanted to end with a project that we did at the Venice Biennale a few years ago when David Chipperfield was the curator. And he made as a theme the idea of common ground. What is it that unites us all? And certainly that's something that we really need to cherish and think about always, but at this particular time it seems very, very important. What is our common ground? So what we decided to do was to ask friends of ours, not all architects, some writers, some artists, to take a box and fill it with things that make them happy and things that inspire them. Because we are trying to figure out, are there common things? Is there a common ground between these people who we call our friends, these people who we know? So many of you have been to the various biennales. You know that there's the long Arsenale, and then there's a Giardini. So we were first given a place in the Arsenale, which is huge, and we realized it felt way too exposed for us. So we asked David whether we could be someplace else that was a little bit more quiet. So we ended up at this tiny little red building in the very, very end of the sort of whole procession through the Biennale, in a shed, which was, it's basically a shed where they stored the sort of lawn equipment. And so here was the shed, and what we really liked about the shed was basically it looked like a bush. And it was sort of hidden. So here we are once again sort of liking very much to kind of pull back and not be so obvious. So if Diana and Chuck's building seems a little bit present, we liked very much this idea of this building which was actually sort of hidden in its vines. But true to Italian fashion, we had these boxes made, and we had the boxes shipped to all of our friends, and then they shipped them to Venice, and they said, oh, don't worry, we'll have all the boxes open, we'll have all the lighting up, we'll have everything ready for you. We arrived 2 days before the opening of the Biennale, and this is what we found. Nothing was open, everything was underneath plastic, there were no lights, there was nothing there. So here we are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. That the person, this is our son, who's very, very handy, and very strong, so we're happy we brought him along. And also in the black t-shirt is a cabinet maker who's a very good friend who made all of these boxes, and so he was also very handy. So we opened up all the boxes. It was really hot, and there were lots of mosquitoes, and what could I say? We were not happy, but we were happy to see the amazing things that people put inside their boxes. So we opened up each box, and we filled up this Casa Scaffali, and some of you may know who some of these people are. That wooden piece here is by Brad Klopfel, and then this is by Juhani Pallasmaa, who lectured here. And everybody did something different. So Brad took these branches and had them turned on a lathe, so they became like the newel posts of a stair. And then Juhani simply went through his studio and took things that he liked and put them inside the box. So we have a piece of bread, and we have his old passports and reels of film of a film by Tarkovsky. And then you may know Max Scoggin and Meryl Elam, who are a kind of crazy duo. And this is what Mac and Meryl sent. So Meryl sent a cape which was made out of feathers, and Max sent red leather pants, which he used to wear when he raced motorcycles. And then they asked the studio to send something, and they sent a pair of legs which could be worn either under the cape or inside the pants. This is Toyo Ito. So he sent a box of rubble that were stones that were part of ruined buildings from the tsunami. And then people wrote on these stones. This is from our friend who is the Claudia Youngstra, who did the wall hangings in the barns. And she has her own sheep, and then she dyes the wool with natural dyes. So this is St. John's wort, and onion skins. And she dyes this to make a color, and she dyed all of these balls of wool from her sheep, and she calls this one Admiring Rumpelstiltskin. This is an image from Francis Carré, who's really a very interesting architect who works in Berlin, but is from, actually, he's royalty in a village, in a series of villages in Burkina Faso, and he's designed schools and housing for teachers in his village. And these are women who are working on building these houses, and the earth is pounded. So he sent a box of dirt and one of these paddles, which women use to pound the earth down, and they sing while they're pounding it. And this one had a really hard time getting through customs. This is our good friend Ursula von Riddingsvard. She's a sculptor, and she works in wood, and she's a little crazy, but this is what she needs to wear this hood because she's always working with sawdust, and so she does this so she can take care of her lungs, and so she filled this box with these carved pieces of wood. This is our son in the green t-shirt and his business partner, and we gave them the assignment to fill the box. And what they did was, and Todd thinks it's edible, but I just think it's our son. They took the box and they cut it up into tiny little pieces. And then they took an 8-ball and they filled it with water from the Venice Canal, and then they put the 8-ball inside the box. And so the box is actually made from all of the pieces of the big box. It just turned into a little box. This is Tom Main. We asked that no one put in anything architectural, but I think Tom Main is Tom Main, and so he couldn't really help himself. This is Stephen Hole. He couldn't help himself either, so he says it's not architectural, but I know that those are models underneath that scrim. This is Peter Zumthor, who is a friend, and he always likes to be difficult. So here's this box. We had the box made. It went from Paterson, New Jersey to Switzerland, and then from Switzerland it was sent to Venice, and we opened it up and it was empty. But then later on the next day, he sent his assistant over, who then took a series of pigments and put them on top of the box and arranged them exactly the way he wanted to. So I think actually that there is a kind of common ground. I think as designers, as landscape architects, as interior designers, as architects, we are all thing people. No matter how digital the world becomes, and we do use digital tools, it's the things that we can touch and that we can smell and that we can hold close that are our common ground and that we love, and that hands come together both in joy but also in making. It's never single hand, it's always many hands, and that is what holds us together. That's what makes us common. Thank you.